All right, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, just fine.
Great.
Okay, take it away, Kate.
All right, thank you, Melanie. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's National NAGPRA Program webinar. My name is Kate Compton-Gore, and I'm the training coordinator at National NAGPRA. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our website after the meeting, along with copies of the PowerPoint presentation that I'm providing today. Your name and attendance at this webinar will also be recorded. If you wish to not have your name or attendance recorded, you may disconnect at this time. After the presentation, we will turn on the question and answer option for the webinar, and you may submit written questions for live responses. Given the size of these webinars, we ask that you not raise your hand or ask questions throughout the presentation. We prefer all questions come through the Q&A in written form. The chat feature will be disabled. Melanie O'Brien, the National NAGPRA Program Manager, and other members of our team will be available to assist me with the Q&A at the end. I want to make a quick announcement that our June webinar will be the steps for repatriation for other cultural items. And if there are any webinar topics that you're interested in, please put those into the Q&A or send us an email at nagpra_info@nps.gov. All right, let's get started.
Looks great, Kate.
Okay. Today's webinar will discuss the steps to repatriation of human remains and associated funerary objects. Please note that I will be following the legal language, but I support and respect the importance of sensitive and culturally appropriate language that may be identified during consultation. This is a screenshot of the steps to repatriation, which is located on our webpage under policy, and I have included the link here. This is my favorite resource. I have this printed out on my desk and I refer to it every day. It's a really great quick start guide that you can use before digging into the details of the regulations. There is also a version for cultural items, which I will show you at the next webinar. This image shows page 2 of the steps to repatriation and the timeline. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but please let me know if there are specific questions during the Q&A, and I'll come back to this at the end of the webinar as well. This is a screenshot also taken from the same document, but I want to focus on the dates in the table. We hear from museums and institutions who are confused about the timeline for reporting human remains and associated funerary objects. The difference is between what is known and what is unknown. The 5-year deadline, which started with the updated regulations in January of 2024, relates to updating an inventory. The 2-year deadline is rolling and applies to completing an inventory for the first time. I'll break this down a little more. The 5-year deadline applies to known human remains and associated funerary objects previously reported in an inventory, and I'm going to repeat that again. The 5-year deadline applies to human remains and associated funerary objects already reported in an inventory, but never published in a Notice of Inventory Completion, or NIC. The 2-year deadline applies to previously unreported human remains and associated funerary objects. So if you have found previously lost or unknown collections, or if you recently acquired possession or control, including transfer of a collection that was previously reported in an inventory, you will need to complete that inventory within 2 years of the date of locating the human remains or associated funerary objects, or acquiring possession or control. So it doesn't have the same start and end date as the 5-year. It's more of a rolling whenever you find these things. This is why it's different from the 5-year deadline. For example, if you recently learned of a collection through a museum statement, you need to complete the inventory within 2 years of acquiring possession or control of the collection. Another example is a human tooth was recently found in faunal remains and had not been previously identified. This would also trigger the 2-year deadline to complete an inventory. So I hope this helps clear up some of the confusion. Okay, let's get into the steps. In step 1, for human remains and associated funerary objects, the first thing you need to do is compile an itemized list. This is a working document that utilizes the information you have on hand in your archives, your database, site files, and other resources. Even if that information may not be accurate, it is what you use to compile the first list from the information available. Don't confuse an itemized list with your inventory. Your itemized list will ultimately become your inventory and will be used to then complete a notice of inventory completion. Museums and federal agencies must include the number of individuals and associated funerary objects, and it can be at least one. As Melanie O'Brien always says, NAGPRA is not an accounting exercise. If you don't know how many individuals are in a box, you can start with at least one. You will also include the provenience, which is geographical information, and the provenance, or the acquisition history, and we understand that there might not be much information. You will also include details like collectors' names, which can be very helpful for tribes who often know about certain collectors and where they were focused on collectings, provenance and provenience information you have on a collection or items, and any other information that may help with cultural affiliation and reporting known hazardous substances. On the other side of this table is what Indian tribes and NHOs may prepare during step 1 and relates to your itemized list. So these are good to think about when compiling the list. Additional information on geographical location, traditional knowledge, and guidelines to future testing for things like pesticides also come here. Identifying the number of individuals. So how to properly identify the number of individuals is another common question we continue to receive at the National NAGPRA Program. It is related to identifying the number of individuals when little to no information is present. The number of individuals must be identified in a reasonable manner and is based on the information you have available, even if that information is minimal or non-existent. This does not signal additional study, research, or analysis of any kind before consent has been given. And if you aren't sure how many ancestors are present, the number is at least one. During consultation, you can discuss next steps for further identification and information needed as requested by tribes. There is a specific resources document related to this topic and the duty of care guidance document. And I have put both of their links at the bottom of this. And I really recommend you go and take a look at these. All of these guidance documents I'm linking here provide a lot of information. So here's an example of one style of itemized list using the table format, and this is also on our template. Here's another format using Excel. This is my preferred format, and the museum I was working for, we would use this. That included information that's helpful to identify items within our institution, but then also is useful for tribes and contains all the necessary information. This list will become your inventory after consultation and ultimately contains the information you will include in your notice of inventory completion, in your inventory, and then your notice. The more information you can provide in this list, the easier it will be to complete an inventory and the notice. So here's a screenshot of our template, and the link is on the bottom of this page. The third format is paragraph format. That was the original guidance on itemized lists from 1993, so we continue to use it here. It's generally not one we see used very often, but I wanted to include it here today. Okay, step 2, initiate consultation with any lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs with potential cultural affiliation. So you need to identify who to consult with using the information that is available to you. And so how do you do this? Information about where the human remains were removed from, the geographical location, including state and county when possible. And if you don't know that, you do know where they are currently located, which can be used as the geographical location for the purpose of identifying tribes with potential cultural affiliation. The invitation to consult must be in writing. It must include the itemized list from step 1, and name all consulting parties. Propose a timeline and methods for consultation. Indian tribes may identify other museums or federal agencies who have similar collections, identify the preference for how itemized lists will be organized, the preference for consulting in a group or individually or a mix, how these will take place, and their preferred timeline and method for consultation. This is where museums must include specific information that tribes may request changes to the details. And please note that there is a template for initiating consultation on our website templates. Remember, this is just a template or guide, and you can create a letter that fits your individual institution as long as it has the required information included. We often get asked about what happens if there's no response. Museums and federal agencies are required to act within certain timelines, and those timelines are required even if there is no response from a lineal descendant, Indian tribe, or NHO to an invitation to consult. A museum or federal agency must initiate consultation prior to completing or updating an inventory, but if there is no response to the invitation, the museum or federal agency must complete or update an inventory by the deadlines required under NAGPRA and submit a notice of inventory completion. We suggest a museum or federal agency document attempts to contact tribes and must demonstrate a good faith effort to consult prior to the deadlines in the regulations. What if I'm already consulting? Do I have to initiate consultation again? The answer is no, as long as you are including all parties in your current consultation. So I've included this slide today because this comes up pretty often with questions we receive. And a comment in the revised regulations stated that broad consultation with all 574 federally recognized Indian tribes is an inefficient manner of handling repatriation of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects with no location information. And I pointed this out in the comments because I wanted everyone to see where I'm going with this and what this means, and what does burdensome and inefficient mean. National NAGPRA wants to stress that broad consultation with all 574 federally recognized Indian tribes and NHOs is not a requirement of the regulations. Ultimately, a museum or federal agency is responsible for identifying consulting parties and initiating consultation based on the information available. Museums and federal agencies can choose to consult broadly with all 574 tribes, even if doing so may be burdensome and less efficient. So if you don't know who to consult with and you have no information on where the human remains are from, you can start with the physical location of where your museum or federal agency is located, or the geographical location of where the collection is physically housed. You can start with identifying the tribes that are most local to that physical location, and during consultation, decide to go out broader and broader with inviting additional tribes with help from tribes that you're consulting with. Additionally, understanding your institution's history, mission, and information about the collections can help identify consulting parties. Step 3, consultation. The museum must respond to any consulting party, request the preferences for consulting, which tribes may make additional requests to. During consultation, museums and federal agencies must report lineal descendants, cultural affiliation, associated funerary objects, and duty of care. And these are highlighted here because this is really what you're doing in consultation. This is what consultation must identify. Tribes may request sensitive information be omitted from the written record and may define access and consent. A record of consultation must be completed and can include the date and location of consultation and tribes involved. If you do not want sensitive information accessible, do not write it down. Museums must also respond to a request for additional information. For example, you have boxes that you aren't sure how many ancestors are in, or if a collection is commingled. During consultation, a tribe can guide the museum on next steps. Remember that during consultation, you must address lineal descendants, cultural affiliation, associated funerary objects, and duty of care. This is a screenshot of the last page of our consultation template that identifies the record of consultation and what was decided. And this is available to all of you. I've included the link here for you to find it, but this really gives you an idea of what that last page is. All right, complete an inventory. Completing an inventory and submitting it to tribes, completing an inventory is submitting it to the tribes and to National NAGPRA. That is what it means to complete an inventory. Information shared during consultation will help update your inventory. List all consulting parties and the dates of consultation, the updated itemized list, and submit it as an inventory. This might not contain all of the information listed on the itemized list, and you do not need to include the original itemized list with your updated inventory or new inventory. Museums may request an extension, but only if approved and letters of consent are given by tribes. Here is our inventory template, and what you see here is a result of consultation and does not include all of this specific detailed information. The difference between the itemized list and the inventory is consultation and cultural affiliation, and this is I've identified it here. So you can see in the example itemized list I gave you earlier, the only thing new now is this cultural affiliation determination. So this is really what you get to after consultation. Once you have completed an inventory, the next step is to submit a notice of inventory completion. We have a template on our website for this step that guides you through the required information. The notice must include an abstract that describes the collection, the total number of individuals and associated funerary objects, the determination of the lineal descendant or cultural affiliation, which might include no cultural affiliation, that will require additional explanation, and the contact information. Please note that in our March 2025 webinar was specifically on notices for both human remains and cultural items, so please refer to that webinar for a detailed, a deeper dive on this section. The notice of inventory completion is due within 6 months after completing an inventory. And you can see here, again, that there are items that museums must do and where tribes and NHOs may. Here is a screenshot of our 2025 updated template for a notice of inventory completion for cultural affiliation. There is also a template for lineal descendants and no cultural affiliation. And I wanted to remind everybody that this is updated. And Melanie recently updated and included new templates, so please make sure that you go and look at those. You must follow the instructions exactly as they are described and not make any changes to the font, line spacing, and brackets. Deviation from the template for a notice can result in a return of a notice and cause delays in publication. And please take time to verify all of your information. So you'll see that lots of notices are publishing right now, and we've been very busy with that. So here in this example, laid out in the looking at this one. It's not on this one, but there are very specific examples of when to remove the instructions page, to not change your font. And if you follow that exactly, then your notice will be published faster. And if you have questions about this, please reach out to the National NAGPRA Program info box. We are always available for technical assistance on any of these topics. So I'm including this example of a notice. Notices are submitted in various lengths. This is a very good, short and concise notice. The abstract lists the necessary information and the cultural affiliation. So here, this museum has included 1,000 ancestors in this one notice and 3 associated funerary objects. One is a lot of shells. Now, the shells contained over 10,000 beads, but those beads did not have to be counted individually. They were counted as a lot. Your notice does not have to be 20 pages long. And you also, we also recommend that you keep it as short as you possibly can. Costs associated with publishing in the Federal Register are very high, and we encourage you, all of you, to take advantage of concise language and keep these as short as possible. We are still receiving notices that are 20 and even over 20 pages long. You do not need to include the entire history of a collection. As in this example, there are 1,000 ancestors, and there are 4 sentences that are describing the abstract, not 4 pages. Sometimes, as an example of this, the abstract section could be 4 pages long. In this revised template, it's not site specific. So the old template for notices was site specific, but the updated template removes that need. So you need to include location information, but that can be to the county and state level. And I mentioned that the shells don't have to be counted individually, that these were included as a lot. It also makes it easier when we are looking at the numbers have to match in the determination section and the abstract information, and we often regularly see those numbers not matching. So that's why I'm including this as a good example of one that's short, it's easy to read, it's easy to count. After publication of a notice of inventory completion in the Federal Register, any lineal descendant, Indian tribe, or NHO may submit to the museum or federal agency a written request for the repatriation of human remains and associated funerary objects. A request for repatriation must be received by the museum or federal agency before the museum or federal agency sends a repatriation statement for those human remains and associated funerary objects. For the purposes of calculating timelines, a request for repatriation received before the publication of the notice of inventory completion is dated the same date as the notice was published. And I want to take a moment to go over this example because this is not uncommon or unusual for tribes to request during consultation and before the notice gets published. So if during a consultation, a tribe requests repatriation, you can decide the best option for writing the request down. Some examples include using the meeting minutes, sending an email, and writing it down on a piece of paper in that moment. Once your notice of inventory completion has been published and you already have a written request for repatriation, that step is complete. So I hope that helps clear that up. This is another area of confusion, and so please let us know if you have additional questions on this. Requests from 2 or more lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs who agree to joint repatriation are considered a single request and not competing requests. A request for repatriation must satisfy one of the following criteria. The requester is identified in the notice of inventory completion, or the requester is not identified in the notice of inventory completion, and the request shows by a preponderance of the evidence that the requester is a lineal descendant, Indian tribe, or NHO with cultural affiliation. So what happens if a notice is published and no request is received? The museum or federal agency waits for a request. It cares for the ancestors under duty of care, and the museum waits for that request for repatriation. This is where the timeline depends on Indian tribes or NHOs to act, and there is no timeline for that to occur. Here is the new template we created for a request for repatriation. We are currently working on a sample letter for museums to respond to a request. Please note, this letter is assuming the requester is identified in the notice. If the requester is not identified in the notice, additional information is required to show the requester is affiliated. And in this notice, this one includes examples of all of the information, just like all of our templates in this first instruction section. So respond to a request for repatriation. As I just mentioned, a template for this step is forthcoming. Please note that a museum or federal agency can go ahead and create a response letter without waiting for our team to develop a template. And remember, you are under a deadline. No earlier than 30 days after publication of a notice of inventory completion, but no later than 90 days after receiving a request for repatriation, a museum or federal agency must send written response to the requester with a copy to any other party identified in the notice of inventory completion. Using the information available, the museum or federal agency must determine if the request satisfies the criteria as identified in step 6. And remember that criteria, as we just mentioned, is in the previous step. Indian tribes or NHOs may request that the repatriation statement is completed by a certain date, prepare a response with additional information, and explore joint requests or other resolutions. And we get to step 8, repatriation. No later than 90 days after responding to a request for repatriation that meets the criteria, a museum or federal agency must send a written repatriation statement to the requester and a copy to the manager of the National NAGPRA Program. Some of you may remember that this was previously identified as a transfer of control document. In a repatriation statement, a museum or federal agency must relinquish possession or control of the human remains or associated funerary objects to a lineal descendant, Indian tribe, or NHO. In the case of joint requests for repatriation, a repatriation statement must identify and be sent to all requesters. After sending a repatriation statement, the museum or federal agency must consult with the requester on custody and physical transfer, document any physical transfer, and protect sensitive information as identified by the requester, from disclosure to the general public to the extent consistent with applicable law. After the repatriation statement is sent, nothing in the act or in this part limits the authority of the museum or federal agency to enter into any agreement with the requester concerning the human remains or associated funerary objects. Here is our template for a repatriation statement. This is the only document that is required. Some museums have presented tribes with additional requirements and paperwork to sign, which is not required and is not something the tribes have to comply with. Only this statement is necessary to satisfy the repatriation requirements. And here we are again with this timeline. And you can see that this can be as short as 42 days or as long as about 3 years, depending on circumstances. And I think that more recently, we are seeing these shorter timelines happen, and it's just dependent upon your circumstances, how long it's going to take your institution. All right. Well, that was pretty fast. I'm going to open up the Q&A now, and please remember, if you want to push favorite questions, you can like them and it will push them to the top of the order.
That was great. Thanks so much, Kate. And as Kate said, we'll be sure to share her PowerPoint along with this recording. The Q&A is open if you have questions you'd like to ask. Can we drop a link in the chat for the screenshots? So they come from a variety of templates and guidance documents, but I can drop the link for the template page and the policy page in the chat. Also, when the presentation is available on our events page, you'll be able to see all the links in the presentation. All right. All right, I'm gonna, there's a question here about summaries, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I'm gonna go to this next question. Do you have advice for how you would make a simple notice of inventory completion with one lot that summarizes what might be a more complicated inventory? For example, where one lot is made up of itemized records from multiple accessions. What's the best way to make sure these are consistent between the NIC and the inventory? That's a great question. The way that you make sure they're consistent between the NIC and the inventory is in the total count. That's the reconciliation that is made between the inventory and the notice. So in that determination section of the notice, where you say how many human remains and how many associated funerary objects, that needs to match up with what can be tallied in your inventory. if you want to revise what your previous inventory included, so for example, say that the previous inventory that was submitted contains 900 beads, and you want to write the notice to say 1 lot of beads, allowing for 1 or 2 more beads to be included. That's fine, and you need to let us know when you submit the notice that that's the change you want to make to your inventory, and we can do that. Or at the same time, you could submit an updated inventory when you submit your notice that changes 900 beads to 1 lot of beads. So the best way to make sure that they're consistent is to send us an updated inventory when you submit your NIC. However, we can accept the NIC as long as we can figure out what the updates are to your inventory that need to be made. So I hope that answers your question. Obviously, we understand that there are very complicated inventories. There may be inventories with a lot of changes or revisions from what was originally submitted. And we're happy to work with you on the easiest way for us to update your inventory records to ensure it matches your notice. But to echo what Kate said in her presentation, keeping the notice as short as possible is in everybody's best interest. And any ways that you can minimize the possibilities of mistakes is also in everybody's best interest. As long as it's still clear what collections you're talking about and who they're being repatriated to. Okay. Let's see, let me sort by upvotes. All right, so this is a question about summaries, but I'll go ahead and ask it because it also pertains to inventories. Can you describe a competing claim scenario for inventory or summary? Sure, I can describe a hypothetical to you. So let's start with inventories because it's sometimes easier to stick with one set of steps at a time. If I were to pull down my copy of the steps to repatriation, then I would look at after a notice is published for human remains, you would then be waiting to receive requests for repatriation. And it may be that you receive competing requests for repatriation. And in that case, then you would respond to those requests in step 7 by saying that you have received competing requests for repatriation. And then it moves to the section of the regulations titled Evaluating Competing Requests. You would, again, notify all the parties that you have competing requests. That's the first requirement of competing requests. The second requirement is to evaluate the information to see if you can determine, you, the museum, can determine who is the most appropriate requester. And there's more detailed guidance in the regulations about what is the most who is the most appropriate requester, depending on which section you're talking about. It is our hope that the regulations really clarify that process and require an outcome to that process. One of the problems that we've seen in NAGPRA over the last 30 years is when there are competing requests, sometimes museums would not make a decision about who was most appropriate. And so the regulations now require that decision be made by the museum within a certain time frame, and that time frame is 180 days after notifying all the requesters. So there's a requirement for a museum to make a decision. And the regulations provide options for that decision making. The decision making can be that you have identified the most appropriate requester, but it may also be the case that your determination or your decision about competing requests is that you cannot determine the most appropriate requester. And in those circumstances, then repatriation is stayed, meaning that it's stopped, it's paused until there's some other resolution between the competing requesting parties outside of the museum's decision-making authority. So I appreciate the question. And again, that what I've outlined applies relatively the same, whether we're talking about summaries or inventories, although the timing can be a little bit different. But I also want to encourage you to not start with a place of conflict. Often, one of the first questions we get when somebody's starting the NAGPRA process is, what happens if people disagree? And I understand that that's uncomfortable and that's challenging, and maybe you want to look ahead to that, but you don't have to go there until you get there. And so the goal of the steps for repatriation is to walk you through a process that hopefully will not have those kind of competing situations, although they are certainly have happened and will continue to happen. Okay, let me sort again. In the case of split and shared collections, is it possible for multiple institutions to publish a joint notice, or does each institution need to publish a separate notice? Either way. We are happy to accept joint notices that have multiple museums included, as long as all the museums agree to the content of the notice and to the decisions in the notice. Publishing one notice is fine. You can find plenty of examples of large group notices, I'll call them, in the Federal Register. I think the most recent one I can remember is from the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology, along with several partner museums, published a notice to cover collections from split and shared collections. So certainly publishing a joint, or I should say, not a joint notice, but rather, or a joint notice, I don't know what to call them. We don't have a term for that. But certainly we can facilitate publication. It saves time, saves money through the publication in the Federal Register, and so we're happy to facilitate that. We just need to be sure that all the parties agree to the content of the notice. And I will add, it's often the best preferred method for some tribes as well. Okay. How does the NIC no cultural affiliation differ from culturally unaffiliated status of the previous regulations? That's a good question. In some ways, it's not different at all, and in other ways, it is different. So let me step back and talk not just about the notices, but about the concept of cultural affiliation, and in particular for inventories. As Kate outlined, through steps 1 through 4, the goal is to make a determination of cultural affiliation following consultation. And that's where your completed inventory, again, as Kate mentioned in that slide, your completed inventory includes that cultural affiliation determination. The revised regulations have laid out basically 4 options for cultural affiliation determinations, or a determination in an inventory, I should say, to be accurate. The first is that there is a lineal descendant. That could be the first determination that's made in an inventory. The second determination is that the human remains and associated funerary objects are clearly culturally affiliated to Indian tribes or NHOs. The third option is that the human remains and associated funerary objects are reasonably culturally affiliated to Indian tribes and NHOs. And the fourth option, the very last choice that a museum can make in its determination on cultural affiliation, is that there is no cultural affiliation, that the museum could not determine cultural affiliation. In that respect, it's similar to the previous regulations and the decision-making process of a museum, where a museum would determine whether human remains and associated funerary objects were culturally affiliated or not. Now, the term for not culturally affiliated has changed over time, as the question asks. Culturally unaffiliated is sometimes used, although that's not accurate in terms of NAGPRA language. The previous terminology was culturally unidentifiable. So that category, that fourth option, still is that there is no cultural affiliation. That's what all those terms mean. The difference in the revised regulations is now a museum or federal agency must publish a notice of inventory completion for that fourth category, for those human remains that have no cultural affiliation. First, the museum must make that decision in the inventory, and then the museum or federal agency must publish that decision in a notice. That is to provide an opportunity for tribes to then make requests for repatriation. Again, to be able to continue the process past step 5 by publishing that notice so that requests for repatriation can occur. So the status isn't really different in that the decision making is the same as the previous regulations. The requirement to publish a notice for those in that fourth category is new, but it is so that then the process can move to tribes who want to make requests for repatriation of those ancestors and objects that do not have cultural affiliation. And that request for repatriation, again, as Kate mentioned in step 6, could be by a tribe that wants to make a request as culturally affiliated and to provide the information to a museum of cultural affiliation. Oh, great. Thanks. I'm glad it helped you to understand. That is what we're here for. Okay. Kate, I'm going to ask this question to you. The question is, we have unidentified bone fragments in the collection. Do we assume these are ancestral remains and include them on an inventory? Provenance information is not available. So unidentified bone fragments in a collection. Do we make an assumption? I would say that alter the question and say, should the museum assume that these are human remains and include them on an inventory? Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to unmute. And so the question, and I'm trying to find the question. I have a little bit of a different visual on my slide. So
Okay.
asking if there are bone fragments and the institution is unknown or unsure if they're faunal or human. Well, in that case, if you were to hire somebody or bring somebody in to determine if they were human or faunal, that could be considered research and unnecessary research and handling without consent. So in that case, I would put the box or where the lot is on your itemized list that during consultation, you can bring that up with the tribes to decide how you should move forward.
Okay, thanks. There's a follow-up to that, which is, do you assume that these are Native American if, say, you don't have any information? And I think that the answer to both questions becomes, what do you know? And I think too often the starting place for a lot of museums is what do they not know? So that's one way to start, but I would encourage you to instead start with what do you know? So what do you know about this collection? What do you know? What can be gained from looking at the objects themselves to determine whether they are human and then whether they are Native American? And this goes back to, again, something Kate said in looking not only at the collection history, but also the history of your institution. So how is it that these collections came to be in your institution? Do you have a general collection practice or history that you could assume these collections fit into? Because again, while you may not have specific information about these objects, you may have information that you can infer based on the general scope of the collection or the situation of your institution that will help you to make that decision about, one, are they human? And two, are they Native American? And in the end, you have to make that decision. You have to make that decision because that's then whether or not you're going to proceed. As Kate said, including these on an inventory, on an itemized list for the purposes of consultation could help you to continue that conversation and to make that decision. However, I will say that an institution can decide that certain collections are not human remains or are not Native American, and therefore NAGPRA would not apply. There is a risk there for a museum in doing so, because if later information shows that they are human or Native American, and the museum ignored that information, then you may have failed to comply. So there's an advantage to making that assumption that both questioners include. But again, that's a decision for the museum to make. Okay. On repatriation statements, does the museum carbon copy all tribes listed in the notice when submitting a repatriation statement to us, and identify the claimant tribe in this, or can the claiming tribe remain anonymous and simply we've received a request that satisfies the requirements? That's a good question, and I left my regulations over here just a minute. It's going to depend on which section we're talking about, so that's why I wanted to look to the regulations themselves to answer your question. I'm going to answer your question based on the inventory section, so human remains. In step 8, repatriation of human remains and associated funerary objects, the written repatriation statement must be sent to the requester, so the person making the request, and a copy to the manager of the National NAGPRA Program. So, in answer to your question, no, you do not CC all the tribes listed in the notice. You only have to send a repatriation statement to the party that made the request for repatriation. And this is because you have already notified all of the tribes listed in the notice that you received a request for repatriation and you responded. That's step 7. So in step 7, you CC all the tribes in the notice and let them know that you've received a request and that you've accepted the request if that's your decision. So just a point of clarification there, because there is a requirement to notify all the tribes listed in a notice that you have received a request and you're responding to that request, but it is in step 7, not step 8. I will add, though, to further complicate your lives, that it is possible to combine step 7s and step 8 into one document. So if you have received a request for repatriation and you want to combine your response with a repatriation statement, that's possible. We put that into our template, but you will need to then send that document that combines step 7 and 8 document to all the parties listed in the notice to meet that step 7 requirement. It's a little bit different in the summary section, but again, your best bet is to look at what the regulations say, because again, we've tried to, in the first sentence of each step, give you the timeline, the what, and the who. So that the when, the what, and the who are in that first sentence in the regulations. Okay, Kate, I'm going to ask you this next question. Since we know that consultation sometimes takes a while, how do we maintain the timelines for inventories?
I looked at this question. I was wondering if I could answer this one. Well, since consultation, as long as the museum is acting in good faith and is following the timelines, the tribes do not have to adhere to those timelines. So if consultation is starting to take longer, then this would be a good opportunity to think about getting support from the tribes to request an extension. But again, there has to be evidence showing that you are acting in good faith and that the tribes support this extension, because maybe something like consultation is taking longer.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. And that's also why in step 2, initiating consultation, one thing that the museum needs to do is lay out what their timeline is for consultation. And in a response, a tribe would then provide their preferred timeline for consultation. And hopefully both of those can be reconciled in time to meet that deadline for completing an inventory. But as Kate mentioned, an extension is an option where the tribes agree and consent to that. All right, the next question by upvotes is, what is the correct protocol to handle sensitive original documents? Are original research documents related to a collection repatriated with the collection? This is a good question. So I am going to answer your question on what the law requires and what the regulations require, which is not quite the same as the question, which is what's the correct protocol. There's nothing in the law or the regulations that would require a museum or federal agency to repatriate documentation. So there's nothing in the law or the regulations that requires repatriation of documents, only of the human remains or cultural items themselves. So to answer your question, original research documents are not required to be repatriated. Can they be repatriated? Absolutely. Do some tribes prefer they be returned? Absolutely. But it's, again, not a requirement. It would be up to the museum or federal agency to decide whether or not it wants to transfer documents related to a collection along with the collection itself, because that is, again, not a requirement under NAGPRA. Can those associated documents be very sensitive? Absolutely. And should that be a part of consultation? Absolutely. Do you have anything to add to that, Kate?
No, I was just thinking that so often I think museums and federal agencies weren't thinking about those sensitive documents. And so that's where including any and all information you can during your consultation and on your itemized list and collecting that is really helpful so that it's not a surprise at the end that could then delay.
Yeah, thanks. I see that Audrey is very busy answering questions for us in the chat. Thank you, Audrey. I'm going to go ahead and clear the ones that you've answered with a link. All right, let me do some more upvote sorting. See what comes to the top. How do institutions move forward with inventories while waiting on tribal consultation to take place to see if collections can be handled, to get the basic information when documentation is lacking? This has been tricky with Cal NAGPRA. Good question. So how do institutions move forward with inventories while needing to wait for consultation to see about handling? And the answer is in rethinking what your question asks about basic information when documentation is lacking. There is no basic level of information that is required by NAGPRA beyond what information you have available to you. So there is no requirement in NAGPRA to gather additional information. So if documentation is lacking, you can proceed with an inventory based on what documentation you do have. You are not required to gather additional information or additional documentation. This goes back to what Kate mentioned in her slide about how you determine the number of human remains, and that between the duty of care guidance that we've provided, as well as the guidance on itemized lists, you can complete an inventory based purely on without opening a box. That's one way we've tried to answer this question in the past. You can complete the process without opening a box, because again, deciding whether you need to get more information is a part of that consultation. And if you're not having the consultation then you are not required to open the box to complete the inventory. In the process of the revised regulations, we actually received some comments that said research, additional analysis of human remains is required by NAGPRA. That is patently false. Congress was very clear that gathering additional information is not required by the law. So you can complete the law, complete the regulations, and complete your inventory without handling collections, certainly, and without gathering more information. Now, you might have questions in that answer about, well, what if I am lacking certain information, and if I opened the box, I would gather that information? Well, it's a decision a museum has to make about how far it's going to go in opening a box, analyzing, studying. That's what the example that Kate shared about the itemized list kind of lays out. Some of those choices that a museum can make at that stage, but also the risk there of proceeding without that consent from a tribe to conduct that level of handling or inquiry. Okay, Audrey, I'm going to go ahead and clarify a little bit on this next question that even though you provided the answer. Should the itemized list be specific to tribes they are sent to, as in not the entirety of a holding or collection? And Audrey clarified with the consulting parties who they are, language from the regulations. I would also point to the previous paragraph there on the itemized list, because it talks about organizing your itemized list. And it may be that if you organize your itemized list based on geographic location, for example, then it might be that when you initiate consultation, you would send that portion of your itemized list to certain consulting parties. So the answer to your question really is, it could be, your itemized list could be specific to certain tribes. It could be organized that way. But that will depend a lot on what information you have available about your collection. So it may be that it is not feasible for a museum to organize its itemized list by consulting party groups and distribute it that way. And it would be easier to send the entire itemized list to all potential consulting parties. Either way is acceptable. It's a decision that the museum must make. The language that we use in the regulations, and that's repeated in other places, is that it depends on the scope of the holding or collection, how a museum or federal agency organize its itemized list. That's found in 1010A. Okay. The next question is, if there's a stay of repatriation, can research be conducted, especially to try to resolve the issue? The answer to that would be no, unless the requesting parties have given consent to that research. So where perhaps the requesting parties and there's not been a resolution to the competing request, and the parties both agree to consent to additional research to try to resolve the matter, then research could be conducted, provided there is that consent. All right, this is a longer one, so I'm going to read it and think about it at the same time. On the notice template, language often states lineal descendants, Indian tribes, NHOs. When we are clearly working with an NHO, can we edit the notice to be specific to just that group? For example, in the template, the number of sacred objects, and it includes the full language. Could you edit it? I think that there are places in the template where you might want to make that edit. However, this is where I would caution you that if you do it in one place, you need to be sure you do it everywhere, which is why everywhere in the template, we repeat all three of those categories. so that the template is useful for anybody and they don't have to make that choice. However, if for some reason you want to condense where it lists the 3 possible parties into one, you can do so. You need to be cautious. There are places where it is actually necessary to identify, for example, who can make requests for repatriation. It could be any of those 3 groups that could make a request for repatriation. Even maybe you only have the cultural affiliation to a specific tribe or NHO. In terms of the bullet point and determinations, which is what you used here as an example, those are the definitions from the regulations themselves, and I would urge you not to change those because, again, this is the decision making of the museum or federal agency stating clearly that you have identified this meets the definition by then quoting the definition of sacred object in the example case. So I would encourage you not to make a change there. But there are maybe other places in the notice where you may want to make that change. That's okay. Again, I would just want to be very cautious that that language isn't used intentionally to be sure that it's accounting for every possibility. And unless you're very sure about the change you're making, I wouldn't recommend making it. But again, it's something that we'd be happy to talk with you about, especially if you have a specific concern. Okay, are there any issues with notifying tribes that the federal agency has gotten a notice from museum of a collection that may be from federal land prior to the federal agency deciding on control? So this goes to the museum statements, and it sounds like what the question is asking, can a museum let tribes know that they've sent a statement before the federal agency decides that it has control? Certainly in that case, if the museum has sent a statement, the museum says that it has custody. And can the museum inform tribes that it has custody and it believes the federal agency has possession or control? Yes, you can do that. You can certainly notify the tribes. You could even, in some limited circumstances, conduct consultation because of the custody. Your consultation needs to be somewhat limited in that it needs to be about the duty of care for that collection, rather than about the cultural affiliation or decision making, which would be with the federal agency itself. And I would caution any museum in this circumstance to be very cautious about what kinds of representations you're making, because you do not have decision-making responsibilities if that collection is only in your custody, and therefore you don't want to overpromise about a collection or its possible repatriation if you do not have possession or control of that collection. Okay, we had some requests for the list of federally recognized tribes. Audrey, I'm going to ask you to actually go find the updated one because the link that was shared is from January of 2024. That list of federally recognized tribes is updated every year, and the most recent list is from December of 2024. So I would ask that we update that with the link to the current Federal Register list of tribes. All right. All right. Just reading through the answers that Audrey's already given. Thanks so much, Audrey. Okay, we're just down to a few more questions. So if you have more questions, put them in. So we have been inviting tribes to consult, but they have not responded. And we need to submit an inventory and an NIC to meet the timelines. But then later the tribes do engage in consultation and identify associated funerary objects that were not included. Can we update the inventory and post a corrected NIC? Thanks for the question. Actually, in this case, you would want to update the inventory to identify the associated funerary objects, but rather than a corrected NIC, you would publish a new NIC for just the associated funerary objects. And we have plenty of examples of that, where a notice is published for additional funerary objects later, and it can refer to the previous notice, but it's not a correction. Rather, it's just an additional notice of inventory completion that identifies additional associated funerary objects. I'm trying to think the best way to tell you to search for that. Yeah, the best way to search for that is if you go to our website, to the Notice of Inventory Completion database, you can sort it by number. And so if you were to sort where the number of individuals is 0, you would find notices that are just for associated funerary objects, and that would might be able to find that example pretty quickly that way. If one tribe submits a joint claim and another tribe submits a claim that doesn't recognize the joint claim, are they considered competing claims? Yes. So here I'm just going to clarify some language. We use the term request in the repatriation section. So where one tribe says we're submitting a joint request and another tribe submits a request that doesn't say it's joint, my first response would be clarify with the second tribe. Make sure that the second tribe means to be submitting a competing request. And if so, then it's a competing request. But if that second request is not clear, then I think the first thing you should do is clarify. Is it competing or is it joint? If it doesn't specify. It may be through that process you'll be able to resolve the issue, but it may be that they do mean to have a competing request. So if there are joint requests, then all the parties need to agree jointly. Okay. The last question. What do we do when tribes have differing opinions on what is NAGPRA and the duty of care? I think the federal agency must decide on the best compromise to move forward. Yeah, thanks, Audrey, for linking to the duty of care. Certainly, there may be disagreements among consulting parties about which objects are NAGPRA cultural items and about how they should be cared for prior to repatriation. And our advice in those circumstances where there's some conflict early in the NAGPRA process is to complete the steps for repatriation, because that is how you will resolve who has the rights to decide how something is cared for and what is a NAGPRA item. So rather than the museum or federal agency making those decisions, you should follow the NAGPRA process. So in the case of human remains and associated funerary objects, you would want to proceed through the notice publication to get to that request for repatriation process. And that's how we would encourage you to move forward. I think this may be a first that we've answered all the Q&A in one of these webinars. I think that's credit to you, Kate, for your presentation, as well as the additional time we had today. So I included the link in the chat to the policy page. I'm just going to go grab the templates as well. Sorry, I got distracted by questions and I didn't finish that. There's the 2 links in the chat for where Kate pulled all of her screenshots are from the documents there. And again, we'll be sharing Kate's PowerPoint along with the recording of this webinar. Kate, anything to add?
No, just thank you very much. And I look forward to next month when we talk about cultural other cultural items.
Yeah, so we'll be going through the same process next month for cultural items.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a great weekend.